The EFI system partition is a partition on a data storage device that is used by machines that adhere to the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. It contains the bootloader programs for all operating systems installed on the device, device driver files for other devices, system utility programs that are intended to be run before an operating system is booted, and data files such as error logs. Overview. The EFI system partition is formatted using the FAT12, FAT16 or FAT32 file system. The globally unique identifier for the EFI system partition in the GUID partition table scheme is C12A7328F81F11D2BA4B00AOC93EC93B, while its ID in the MBR partition table scheme is 0xEF. Both GPT and MBR partition disks can contain an EFI system partition, as UEFI firmwares are required to support both partitioning schemes. Also, El Torito bootable format for CD-ROMs and DVDs is supported. It supports backward compatibility with legacy systems by reserving the first block of the partition for compatibility code, effectively creating a legacy boot sector. On legacy BIOS-based systems, the first sector of a partition is loaded into memory and execution is transferred to this code. UEFI firmwares do not execute the code in the master boot record, except when booting in legacy BIOS mode through the compatibility support module. Despite the fact MBR partition tables are required to be fully supported within the UEFI specification, some UEFI firmwares immediately switch to the BIOS-based CSM booting depending on the type of boot disk's partition table, thus preventing UEFI booting to be performed from EFI system partitions on MBR partition disks. Booting from removable media such as USB flash drives is supported. A removable device needs to be formatted using the FAT12, FAT16 or FAT32 file system, and booting can be performed either by storing a bootloader according to the standard ESP file hierarchy, or by providing a complete path of a bootloader to the system's boot manager. Usage: Linux. Grub2 and Elilo are serving as conventional, full-fledged and standalone UEFI boot managers for Linux. They both allow accessing and booting kernel images outside the EFI system partition. EFI boot stub makes it possible to boot a Linux kernel without the use of a conventional UEFI bootloader. It allows an x86 kernel image to be loaded and executed directly by the UEFI firmware, masquerading itself as a PECOFF image and appearing to the firmware as an UEFI application. Both BIOS and UEFI bootloaders can still load and run the same kernel image, thereby allowing a single kernel image to work in any boot environment. Support for the EFI boot stub is enabled by turning on the option config EFI stub during kernel configuration. It was merged into the Linux kernel mainline in kernel version 3.3, released on March 18, 2012. Gamma Boot is a simple UEFI boot manager which executes configured UEFI images, accessing only the EFI system partition. Configuration file fragments, kernel images and initrd images are required to reside on the EFI system partition, as there is no support for accessing files on other partitions or file systems. Linux kernels need to be built with config EFI stub enabled so they can be directly executed as a new EFI image. Mount point for the EFI system partition is usually EFI, where its content is accessible after Linux is booted. Windows. Microsoft recommends that when partitioning a disk, the EFI system partition be the first partition on the disk. This is not a requirement of the EFI specification itself. On Windows XP 64-bit edition and later, access to the EFI system partition is obtained by running the mount-vol/s command. Appli Euro Intel. On Appli Euro Intel architecture Macintosh computers, the EFI partition is initially blank and not used for booting. However, the EFI partition is used as a staging area for firmware updates. Specifically, it places a firmware flash utility and data file in the directory EFI firmware which is then run when rebooting the system in flash firmware mode. If deleted, the system will still boot, and the boot manager will still allow users to choose whether to start a boot camp partition or the default Mac OS X, but firmware updates will fail. See also, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, BIOS boot partition, system partition and boot partition, Windows to Go, references. External links, EFI System Partition Subdirectory Registry. UEFI a registry of the subdirectories that lie below the /EFI directory on an EFI system partition.